Welcome to Resistance Live. Since 2017, Resistance Live has been the go-to home for political and legal news and analysis through a decidedly progressive activist lens. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. I'm a former Wall Street and human rights lawyer, a lifelong organizer, and a leadership and impact consultant for all those seeking to lead big progressive change in these incredibly challenging times. To get bonus broadcasts, ask questions, and more, don't forget to become a paid subscriber to the show at patreon.com/resistancelive. And to learn more about what we do to help progressive leaders everywhere, check out GaiaLeadershipProject.com. And now, here's today's show. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Resistance Live. It's the 23rd of October, 2025. And I know that everybody has really been struggling in the last couple of days, particularly with the teardown of the White House and developments regarding ICE in New York City and elsewhere. And, just looking at the question feed this morning over on our Patreon, it's really obvious that a number of you are having a really hard time. So I just want to remind everybody here that it's okay to check out from the news for a day if you're really struggling. I also will just tell you that my personal viewpoint on this at this point is that if we don't check out of the news from time to time, we're all going to lose it and not be able to actually do the good work that we need to be doing out there right now. So I just wanted to start out by saying this, right? I've said this before, but being in this news cycle 24/7 right now is a lot like swimming in sewage. And you can't stay clean if you're swimming in sewage all the time, meaning from like a mentally healthy perspective. So please take breaks if you need to. The work will still be here, right? The news will still be here. You're not going to miss anything. All right. Okay. With that said, I do want to start with some relatively positive news. It comes on the heels of some not so positive news. So yesterday, federal troops, which appears to be an amalgam of ICE and other agencies, arrived at the Coast Guard station in Alameda, California, presumably to prepare for an invasion of San Francisco. I'm going to remind you all that we talked about Mark Benioff on this broadcast last week, and I talked a lot about him on Blue Sky as well. From the perspective of his comments, which were quite shocking, that he supported Trump sending troops to invade San Francisco, rather. And one of the reasons why that was so shocking is that Benioff has been like one of the only billionaires that people have historically thought was kind of probably a little bit of a good guy. And now he's all in for Trump. Well, so he made those comments last week, and now lo and behold, here we are with troops descending on Alameda, presumably to invade San Francisco and perpetrate the kind of violence that we've seen in New York City and LA and Chicago and elsewhere. So yesterday, the district attorney of San Francisco, who's a very accomplished lawyer in her own right, Brooke Jenkins, announced that she does intend to prosecute ICE and other federal officials who cross a legal line should they take action in San Francisco. And that means, by the way, kidnapping people. I'm going to remind everybody that we've been talking over the last couple of days about this raid that was conducted on Canal Street in New York City. Further reporting on that last night indicated that literally ICE dropped in on Canal Street, major tourist hub where folks go to buy knockoff handbags and other things, descended on Canal Street and essentially rounded up anybody black who was of African descent and put them in a van. No probable cause, no warrants to arrest, no legitimate form of investigation, literally just straight racial profiling to pick people up and essentially put them in human detention camps. That is per se illegal under state law. Like, it literally is something that not only violates the Constitution, but it can violate a lot of local laws. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this one plays out, because if DA Brooke Jenkins, in fact, who by the way is considered only a moderate Democrat, not a far left-leaning Democrat, if she indeed begins prosecutions of federal officials who have crossed state law lines, we're in for a really interesting ride. Now, I do want to flag for everybody that there is this thing called removal, which you may remember back from the prosecutions against Donald Trump in Fulton County, Georgia, where numerous defendants in that case sought to remove the case to federal court, even though it was brought under Georgia law. removal, which is where basically you're like, there's a federal reason for us to be in federal court, even though you brought this case in state court. I'm doing this in very layperson's language. My apologies to the lawyers in the room. I know it's way more detailed than that, but I want people to generally understand the concept. The way that this could apply here is that if, in fact, ICE officials are prosecuted, they could seek to remove their prosecutions to federal court on the grounds of a federal defense, which could be something like a qualified immunity defense or something along those lines. Now, whether or not they would be successful at doing that is a very significant question, but I'm also just going to point out that they would then be removing to a friendly federal court, to a prosecution, presumably, in the U.S. district courts for California. So this is something that I've kind of been waiting to see how it unfolds. And I will just mention that Brooke Jenkins is not the first local district attorney to threaten to do this. 2 weeks ago, the district attorney for Portland, Oregon, who is Nathan Vasquez, said that he was planning to do the same if ICE stepped out of line in Portland, which of course now it has. Now I have to point something out to folks, which is that one of the challenges of a prosecution like this is the issue of the identity of the perpetrators. And this is one reason, by the way, where we're seeing now ICE agents, not just in, with the masks that cover their noses, but in recent photos, particularly ones where they've been kidnapping people out of courtrooms, we're seeing baseball caps, hair coverings, sunglasses, and then masks that cover the remainder of their face. So identification is a challenge here for purposes of prosecution, but I have kind of little doubt that they're going to be able to get someone eventually. And indeed, some of the raids that have taken place in places like Chicago recently, we've seen people more unmasked. People were kidnapped out of a Home Depot in Chicago yesterday, the inside of a Home Depot. And some of those officers were not masked when they were doing it. So in any event, I've been flagging for quite some time here that we were likely to see some form of conflict eventually between state prosecutors enforcing state law and what ICE was doing in cities and other law enforcement might be doing in cities. And that moment now appears to have arrived. I don't doubt that this San Francisco DA can be taken at her word, frankly. And I think right now, one of the things that we also have to take away from recent events is that making plain your position on these things before an invasion happens can sometimes change the trajectory of the invasion. So shout out to Brooke Jenkins. And, this is something that we absolutely have to watch. Okay, speaking of New York City, last night, there was a pop-up protest. My gosh, you got to love New York. I love New York. You all know that. Like I'm a New Yorker, pretty much. One of the things that happened last night was that there was a pop-up protest in New York City, again, in response to these raids on Canal Street that literally on like 6 hours notice was thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Foley Square, which is, of course, that kind of area in downtown Manhattan that is surrounded by the courthouses and the clerk's office where people get married, and also the state courts in New York City. Really incredible turnout and lots of really loud and really angry people for all good reasons. So, again, I have to remind everybody, and we actually have a video coming out about this on Monday on the Ripple Effect Institute channel, our sister channel, that one of the things that's really important to remember here about the kind of resistance and pushback that we need right now is that it needs to be sustained. That, showing up for one protest or one event is not going to get it done. And that even on the heels of the high of no kings from last weekend, we have to remember that it is sustained political action, both in the form of community organizing and, yes, in the form of disruption, that needs to happen on an ongoing basis. And I'm not talking here about a general strike. We've talked a lot about why general strikes are really difficult to accomplish in the United States of America, for reasons of geography, for reasons of employment, for reasons of private health insurance. Nonetheless, sustained protesting in the form of pop-up protests, in the form of ongoing protests against ICE are really very critical. And so I was really happy to see that. I take that as a positive. Okay, last thing on ICE news for today. There is some breaking news this morning about ICE's recruitment efforts. Now, many of you have speculated, as have I, about who is actually signing up to join ICE right now and what that might signify. Well, the bad news, or maybe the obvious news, is that ICE has got some really serious problems with the people who are signing up. So the breaking news now is that the training program for ICE, which used to be 13 weeks, has now been reduced to 6. That fully half of the recruits, I just want you guys to think about this before I even get to like the final part of this. Half of the recruits could not pass a written open book test. Okay. I just want everybody to like acknowledge this. An open book test. Like the answers are in the book. You have the book open while you are taking the test. Could not pass the test. Okay. On top of that, huge numbers of their recruits are failing their fitness test, which essentially requires you to run at 6 miles per hour. Okay. If anybody like has ever done training, 6 miles per hour is not fast. Essentially what they are requiring is that a recruit can run 1.5 miles in under 14 minutes. Like I can walk 1.5 miles in 15. So, you know, this is really quite significant. And then on top of it, we have the fact that a number of these recruits have failed drug tests, have failed criminal background checks, and have refused to be fingerprinted or drug tested until they were already like well into training. So clearly not the best people, but we already knew that. And also, you know, it raises very significant questions on 2 fronts. So we all know that ICE got this huge budget increase with the last budget negotiation before the government shutdown. And we talked earlier this week about the fact that they're using that money to buy weapons, including weapons for war, and also that they are in this kind of like huge hiring uptick because Trump, I didn't mention this before, but I'm going to mention it now. Trump has set a quota of 3,000 arrests per day by ICE, which they clearly can't do unless they've got, you know, like 10,000 people on the US streets, right? In the form of ICE and other cooperating law enforcement. So they have a problem. And again, I have pointed out that they have had problems recruiting people, period, which is why they have offered to pay off student loans, why they have been offering people $100,000 a year. And all of these various things are contributing to a problem in actually having people who can carry out the job. Now, I have to remind everybody this is good news, okay? Because even in the face of all the terrorism and violence that they're perpetrating right now in the streets of US cities, they cannot carry out their long-term goals without the manpower to do it, all right? So one of the things that I just feel like I have to reiterate on a regular basis right now is they are engaging in forms of stochastic terrorism that are designed to terrify everyone else into policing themselves, okay? Somebody said to me like this morning on the Patreon feed, are these random boat bombings Trump's desire to go to war? Actually, no. My theory on this, and it's very grounded in like what we know about how fascist dictatorships work, is that what they are doing is merely proving that they can kill anybody at any time for any reason and get away with it. All right. The reason why they are doing that, first of all, it's to make snuff films that they can put out on social media. And it's really sick, right? They're just randomly targeting boats now in both the Pacific and in the Caribbean and murdering people. Again, they could board those boats at any time for less money than it costs to bomb them, but they just want to execute people for no reason. They're doing that to scare people. They're doing it because they actually can't carry out that kind of violence inside the United States. And they're doing it because, among many other gestures that they're engaging in right now, they want people to be afraid. They want people to feel threatened and stopped, essentially stopped from taking action, stopped from organizing, stopped from protesting, stopped from stopping ICE. Okay. And so you have to keep in mind here that they would have no need for the kinds of stochastic terrorism that they're engaging in, the kinds of violence that they're engaging in on a small scale that's designed to terrify people on a large scale, if they actually had the people power that they needed to execute on these plans for mass deportation, prosecution of every protester, you know, like all this stuff, right? They don't actually have the power to do it, the manpower, the person power to do it. And so I just want people to look for the silver lining in things like this, because we all need a lot of hope right now, and we need that motivation to keep going. And the fact that they are losing like half of their recruits because they can't finish a written test with an open book in front of them is actually a sign of weakness, right? They're not getting people into ICE right now who actually are remotely capable of doing the job. And that's really good, actually. That's really good. Okay. I was asked, actually, before I get to that, I want to talk about Mamdani and the New York City debate last night, which was amazing. And while I know this is kind of a local story, it is really significant on the national news front for one reason. Okay. So first of all, Cuomo crashed and burned repeatedly. Mamdani brought one of the women who Cuomo sexually harassed, who has been an active participant in campaigning against him, to the debate last night. And when Mamdani questioned him about when Mamdani questioned him about what he would say to this accuser, he basically went off the rails, like didn't apologize, didn't admit that he had done anything wrong, didn't say that he would change his behavior, but gave a completely sideswiping answer that really wasn't even on topic. But the more significant news about Mamdani yesterday was something that really actually matters a lot. Okay. So many of you have heard me talk before about the broadcaster Andrew Schultz, who is kind of like populist right-wingy. He's not as right-wing as, say, Rogan. He's definitely not as right-wing as, say, Benny Johnson or Steve Bannon. But he's in that kind of like libertarian-esque right-wing bandwidth. And he has an enormous following on his podcast and on YouTube. Like, huge. Millions of people listen to him and his bro friends every day. And his podcast is built in large part on mockery. Okay. Zohran Mamdani did his podcast yesterday and charmed the pants off of Andrew Schultz. Like, it actually, the footage out of this, and I've referred to this before because Andrew Schultz did a couple of interviews of people during the 2024 election cycle that were fairly significant. But this interview is really interesting because Mamdani was talking about Bill Ackman, who many of you know is like a huge GOP donor who has been pouring millions of dollars into the Cuomo campaign to try to stop Mamdani because he lives in New York and he doesn't like the idea of being taxed as a billionaire. All right. He's been out on social media slamming Mamdani. There's been a lot of like, you know, step right up to the line of Islamophobia and racism there. And so Mamdani was asked by Andrew Schultz about Bill Ackman. And Mamdani, who was like, you know, first of all, they were like, he's never going to leave New York. He's claiming he's going to leave New York, find the mayor. He's posting his tweets from New York. And they were all laughing about it. But then Mamdani said, and what's crazy about this is that the amount of money that he's pouring into this race to try to beat me is more than I would tax him. And the room erupted in laughter. Now, the reason why this is such a significant moment is because that was Zohran Mamdani getting right-wing libertarians to crack up about the prospect of taxing the super rich, humiliating a billionaire who has been out there saying taxing the super rich is the end of America, right? And with Andrew Schultz having this incredible audience of like a huge audience, not necessarily an incredible audience, huge audience of white male young men, who we all know, by the way, Mamdani has been pulling away in the polls from, it has even like brought Trump voters over to his side, is a moment that cannot be missed in the standpoint of, from the standpoint of how this campaign is revolutionary. All right. And I have to point this out because I don't understand, like Hakeem Jeffries, even last night, would not commit to voting for Mamdani in the election on Chris Hayes. I have no idea what the senior leadership of the Democratic Party is thinking. We have a once-in-a-generation political talent running for the mayor of the largest city in the country. He is managing to pull all those elusive voters that the Democrats claim to think they need in the form of young white men over to his side. And he's doing it by being an incredibly effective communicator everywhere he goes, whether he's celebrating Diwali at temples in Jackson Heights with the Hindu population of New York, whether he's celebrating Eid with his fellow Muslims in New York, whether he's going on white male broadcaster podcasts that cater to an audience that everybody would think the Democrats are struggling to get. Why you wouldn't want to learn from that is completely beyond me, right? And I look at this and what I see is the future. And what I see is the prospect of incredibly compelling, progressive, democratic socialist candidates appealing to a base that really cares about these kinds of issues. The cost of living, right? Access to transportation, making sure that people have what they need right? Like, these are issues that appeal to a very wide base if they are effectively communicated through a qualified messenger. And so I just want everybody to know that, like, that interview on that podcast last night showed exactly what is possible. He's got libertarians laughing about efforts to try to stop taxing the rich. I mean, like, I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime. And frankly, I think it's a sign of what's to come. So a very big deal. Okay, somebody asked me about this lawsuit, and I have not had a chance to dive into it very much lately, but I'm just going to mention it anyway. Michael Wolff, the author, who of course is claimed to have seen photographs of Trump from Epstein's safe, sued Melania Trump yesterday because he got a letter from Melania Trump's lawyer seeking to resolve a claim of defamation. Apparently, he authored a piece that, or was interviewed for a piece in the media that said that Melania was deeply involved in the Epstein cover-up. And now he's sued. Her lawyers wrote a letter saying you should compensate us for defamation. His lawyer, he said no. And then he sued Melania Trump in response. So I just have to point something out, okay? Like, Michael Wolff, I take what he does with some suspicion. And the thing I will just say about this case as well is I am struggling to figure out exactly what he sued her for. I have not had a chance to actually read the complaint, but it's not the kind of factual scenario where you would imagine that there is a legitimate lawsuit against her. Like, if you don't want to pay somebody for a claim of defamation, ordinarily you flip them the bird, so to speak, and you wait for them to sue you. Countersuing for some form of damages when they haven't actually taken action against you doesn't make any sense. And, you know, Michael Wolff's credibility has been questioned in the past. That's one reason why I am suspicious about some of his claims from time to time. But this lawsuit just doesn't seem to me like it's really going anywhere. It's the kind of case that to me looks like it's ripe for a motion to dismiss. And, you know, I'm told he's out there claiming that Trump is going to have to be deposed in that case. I am not sure that case is going to make it through the very first stage of litigation. So hold tight. We'll wait and see. And, you know, we'll see what's next. And by the way, the article that he wrote on the Daily Beast claiming that Melania was deeply engaged in the Epstein scandal has subsequently been withdrawn by the Daily Beast on a claim that it did not meet their journalistic ethical requirements. So kind of a mess there, right? And for the person asking in the comments that it chills free speech, how has it chilled his free speech? How is her threatening to sue him for defamation chilled his free speech? It hasn't. He's still out there speaking. Nobody's stopping him from speaking. There's no intervention in what he can do. So, you know, this is again a moment to remind people that just because somebody sues in a way that makes us go like, ooh, that looks juicy, doesn't necessarily mean that the lawsuit is legitimate or will survive the standard procedures of a civil cause of action. All right. Final question that I had today was about grand jury indictments, because somebody wanted to understand, like, I don't know, how grand jury indictments are working in these instances where we are getting these indictments of like Jim Comey and Letitia James and others. Okay, so just so people understand, grand juries do not function like what we call petit juries or petite juries, if you're going to actually pronounce it with a French accent. Petit juries are trial juries. That's where, like, you see 12 people and they, you know, decide beyond a reasonable doubt whether someone's innocent or guilty, or if it's a civil case, they decide whether or not, based on a preponderance of the evidence, that the party that is being sued is liable. All right. Those jurors serve for a limited window of time for a single case. Okay. Grand juries in most instances are impaneled for a number of weeks, sometimes for a number of months. And it is larger usually than a petit jury. And the grand jurors come back over and over again to hear evidence in a single case or in multiple cases. But the format of the presentation of evidence is very different. Okay. First and foremost, you are generally speaking not allowed to have a defense attorney present if you happen to be testifying in a grand jury environment. Grand jury proceedings are secret. None of the evidence that is presented to grand juries is ever supposed to be provided to the public. And on top of it, the standards for procuring an indictment are much, much, much lower than the standards for a criminal conviction. All right. And yes, there are jokes running around all the time that you can indict a ham sandwich with a good prosecutor. That's true. I will just point out nonetheless that prosecutors from the DOJ are having a very hard time right now procuring indictments against people who have thrown sandwiches at ICE or people who spit on ICE officers when they've claimed that's assault. Okay. So you can't get an indictment no matter what. That's not how it works. But the standards tend to be much lower. All right. So that's a little primer on how grand jury indictments work. I will just tell you that, in instances here where, a prosecutor walks in and says, here's the mortgage records, here's the evidence that this person received rent when they claimed that they weren't going to receive rent, indict them. That's something that could probably be procured without too much trouble, even though the prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia who were fired or quit had informed senior leadership at the DOJ that they didn't think they had a case against, for instance, Letitia James. So again, I have to point out that I have big questions about whether these cases are even going to go to trial, whether they will survive the early proceedings process, because we know motions for vindictive prosecution and other types of motions are going to come. But we will have to wait and see what happens with those. Just please understand that grand juries have a much lower standard for indictment than you have for conviction, and also that they tend to be much larger and they hear matters over a number of months, sometimes multiple cases over multiple months. And that really kind of depends on state and local procedure, but that's kind of how it works. Okay. All right. That's it for today. Quick reminder, a week from today, our new program, Power Lab, closes for registration. This is a class that is designed for emerging organizers, meaning beginning and intermediate organizers who maybe are feeling like completely overwhelmed, unsure of how to make a difference right now, and to take you to a place where you know how to effectively build community power. Okay. It's a 7-week course. We finished the week of Christmas and right before it. And it's really designed to give you everything that you need to know right now about how to build out community power where you live. Strongly encourage you to join that. We have a good group of people signed up for it already. And I will, of course, make sure I drop the link for that above when we're done today. Also, just a quick thank you to all of our Patreon subscribers. If you have not yet joined us, we are running a 20% off promo right now between now and the end of the year on annual subscriptions. You can join us for 20% off using the code FALL2025. Your paid subscriptions are what allow this broadcast to continue, allow me to pay my staff, allow us to keep doing this work on a daily basis. You help to feed my children, which is really nice for me as a single mom. So please make sure that you are supporting this broadcast financially if it is meaningful to you. And of course, we appreciate your subscriptions wherever you're listening in. Please like this broadcast, comment on it, and make sure, by the way, that if you're listening on a podcasting format, you give us a 5-star review because it helps with our distribution. All right, everyone, lots of love. I will catch you all back here tomorrow at regular time. Take care. Bye. That's our show for today, folks. Thanks so much for being here at Resistance Live. To get more out of the show, including bonus broadcasts, the answers to all your most pressing political and legal questions, and way more, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive and become a paid subscriber. And don't forget to hit subscribe here on your favorite podcasting platform to make sure that you never miss an episode. See you next time.